one of the persons who was nearly every day discussing the situation, the news, perspectives, articles, was Rakesh. So apart from the making of the book, the writing of it, and the way Rakesh, not just Rakesh, Debjyoti, Anubhuti, Sukriti, Vibhuti, Shom, I mean, there are all, they know the inner story, the inner reality. We don't have to go back to that. How these things happen with me. They wouldn't have happened without their being with me. So that is the journey in the literally physical sense, that they were literally there with me at literally every word of the book. But Rakesh in particular, because not just that I was dictating the book, he was typing it, he was the first reader of the book. He read the entire text and we edited it together as he read it out to me, but also to the discussions. That is crucial for me. I and Rakesh, but others, but I and Rakesh in particular, would discuss nearly every day at something very important, at a newspaper level. What is the news today? So I am very weak in social media. So you'd bring me social media, the daily thing that is circulating in social media, and I would tell him that this is what I read in the newspaper. And between us, we try to make a kind of world of news in the sense of something which, of course, could also be looked at as data in a very corrosive reductionist sense, but also in the other way of looking at news as something, Hegel used to say, reading the newspaper is modern man's morning prayer. So in a sense, I belong to that belief system. Reading the newspaper is my morning prayer, but also morning discussion, which I and Rakesh in particular used to really have. Up to now, it's carrying on, because like Rakesh said, that nothing seems to have changed. Things have only seemed to have gotten worse. And the challenge of continuing to discuss, continuing to read, continuing to write if possible, I mean, it becomes that much more difficult with each day, and yet one tries to go on. So that's why these discussions are so important to me. Also in very specific senses, literally the events that happen. And this book, like Brahma has already given you glimpses, this book is a mixed book. It is a kind of mixed idiom. I mean, this word philosopher, I will have nothing to say about that. People are kind enough to use that very sort of exalted word for me. I have no identification with that word, frankly. So I will keep a distance again from that word, philosopher. Nevertheless, there is a philosophical idiom in this book, definitely. But then there is a completely other kind of idiom, which is very empirical, which is like really, really the daily news, fragments, words, silences, cries, which literally happen every day. So all that is also an idiom. And then there's the idiom of something which could be called documents. And there things are very delicate, because I am not someone who is in any way, like Brahma pointed out, a kind of legitimate reader of documents of Israel-Palestine history. I'm not a historian in general, but also I'm not particularly, I have no deep or long familiarity with the Palestine-Israeli question, beyond again a long, because we have grown up from the 70s and in a sense been at some distance but aware of the different phases of the Palestine-Israel situation in its different phases. So I've been equally aware of that, but not as a specialist, as part of the public. That one person, one anonymous person in the public comes to write a book on something which is also so demands such close reading of documents is a question of, well, if you want, do I have the right to do it? And yet I have done it for whatever it's worth. So there is that question too, the documentary question. I mean, in the sense of the documents of a history, a specialized question, which is also an idiom. And then the idiom of something which, yes, probably I took some freedom there, and I felt confident to take some freedom there, which Brahm already pointed out, which is a kind of document of a kind of, the idiom of a kind of methodological thinking, methodological fabrication. For instance, the tool or the prism of, Brahm mentioned that phrase, which I use quite a lot, scenario thinking. But actually what is interesting in this book is, and it belongs to the my being in the situation of like discussing with Rakesh and others about the daily news, my reading of the newspaper, my watching television news, mainstream television news about Gaza and related and other issues and so on and so forth. In all of that, something relatively unfamiliar also plays a part in the fabrication of this idiom of how to look at something which otherwise is very different. And that, of course, is also an accidental, fortuitous Hindi mein ittafaq, which made me use something from cinema, actually cinema. My friend and also interlocutor Vaibhav Abnave, who's also teacher of film, he pointed out almost before October 7th, before this latest unbearable sequence started unfolding. Before that, in a conversation, he told me about a film which Godard was a part of, Jean-Luc Godard was a part of, which is called a film which is a compendium film. It is a film about Vietnam that was made in 1967 with many filmmakers contributing small films on Vietnam. And that compendium, that entire film of different films is called Far from Vietnam. So Godard's own film is called Camera I, Camera EYEI. Initially, it was Vaibhav who informed me about this film. And then I learned more about it, read about it. And of course, the sheer accidental resonance, which could occur to any of us between Far from Vietnam and Far from Gaza. In a way, when the situation in Gaza literally hit us, this resonance equally hit me. When I started to speak about it in some public forums. But the film is something which is, for a moment, we need to quickly get a sense of what this film is. This film is quite remarkable. Like I said, it's part of a film which is not Godard's own film. I mean, it's not a single film. Godard's own film is a small one. There is other filmmaking like Agnes Varda. The film is curated by Chris Marker, a great filmmaker of those years. Chris Marker is the one who actually curated it. So Godard had an initial idea for the film, which was rejected by the other, the curator and other filmmakers. Then he came up with this one, which is called Camera I, in which Godard is seen sitting behind a camera, a movie camera, and talking, not shooting anything, talking about the impossibility of being in Vietnam, North Vietnam in particular, and in a very empirical sense actually, not abstractly, that he couldn't travel to North Vietnam at that time. And he spoke about that. See, instead of making a film in the sense of images, shooting, material, whatever, he makes a film which is, in that sense, what I call in my book a sterile film. In the literal sense, you don't shoot nothing, but you talk sitting behind a camera. And the camera eye is the only thing that is actually to be seen. And speaking. So in that sense, strictly speaking, this film would be called speculative. It's a kind of speculative film because it films nothing. Why speculative? Because it can only speculate about Vietnam in that time, 1967. Anyway, I don't want to go too far with this discussion because you can read it and find out more about the film and all that. But what is clearly the question in this book is, in a situation now when the situation unfolds in the media sources, from the social media to the newspapers to the mainstream news, which also uses video and other materials which sort of circulate in each of these channels, can we make a film in the sense that Godard made his film called Far from Vietnam, called Far from Gaza? So it is the tool of thinking about Gaza actually arises from a fortuitous reference to Gaza, but eventually becomes a logical question to ask. Because it's Vietnam after all, it's not any film, no? So if it's Vietnam, and it was Vietnam which led to the most passionate and uncompromising protests in the West at that time, it is Gaza which is leading to the even greater, more widespread and passionate, but also deeply saddened protests. Zizek spoke recently about sadness of the protests of what is going. So there is enthusiasm, which very kindly Rakesh used that word for me, but there is also deep sadness. We can't take that away in the protests collectively. So on the one hand, there is clearly, and we talk about Gaza in the context of Vietnam, particularly in Europe, in the West, and so on, in America particularly. But at the same time, can we make a film like Godard did, a speculative film? Because you see, of course, traveling to Gaza is another question. But you can't say that we are far from Gaza in the sense of how Godard could say that thing. Because Godard literally had to, though it's a complicated question because Vietnam was a French colony, nevertheless, in general, Vietnam for Godard was invented by the American War. So in a way, American War, which is the product of complicated 20th century politics, leads to the question of what is Vietnam? You can't really say that about Palestine in today's society. That's why we come back to Brahm's question about the question of scenario and all that, but also the term that I use, media society, which is not my term, so much literature has been produced around it, called media society, which is a mode of access to what is going on anywhere in the world, but also the mode of access, in the sense that what does that mode do to enable this thinking, or also influence this thinking, or even block this thinking. This is the question I ask in relation to Gaza, but constantly there is a kind of back and forth between the imagined me and the imagined Godard. So I do carry out a kind of imagined dialogue with Godard in this book till the very end. That can I sit behind a sterile camera today and talk speculatively? At one level, like Brahm said, that's the only thing I can, because I am physically so far from Gaza. On the other hand, I cannot, because I'm surrounded by images which actually produce a completely different, literally cinematic effect. That effect I call scenario. So scenario has two sides to it. One is the effect of scenario, or the scenario effect, but also the discourse and technology of scenario. Now, very quickly, there are three sources for the question of scenario. One is an artistic to sort of mediatic question. So in cinema, early modern cinema, as different from theatre, where you write scenes, but which grow into acts, and acts grow into plays, dramas. It is in early modern cinema that you started writing scenarios, which are a sequence, which make sequences, which also part of what later came to be known as screenplay. So scenarios are very interesting hybrid things, which are ideas, images, little fragments, documents even, but eventually what they do is they don't create a perfect narrative or a total meaningful beginning to end, which is also a kind of story told through time. They do what could be called produce an effect of shock or sensation, a kind of instantaneity, and it had great artistic power in early modern cinema, a kind of instantaneous effect through a little scenario, which is between a story and an image. So that is one source, but there is another source, at least another. There are other sources, but at least another let me mention, from a completely different register. And this actually I studied during my book on COVID, not really on COVID at all, but again a form of distance in the situation of COVID, where I studied again as a non-specialist military history a little bit, particularly in America, post Hiroshima bombing, Nagasaki Hiroshima bombing, but also military thinking, which actually started talking about possible scenarios of natural disaster, including plagues, viral attacks. So virus was seen as an enemy, like a military enemy. So there was a science, a strange science, which you read about in these military history kind of documents, which is called futurology. Yes, there was a particular American writer called Herman Kahn. He was supposed to be one of the first futurologists. And he gave futurology a definition. And the definition was scenarios of the impossible. Or, if you want, scenarios of the unthinkable. Now, this is very interesting and strange. On the one hand, you're saying it's impossible, it's unthinkable. On the other hand, you're actually making scenarios, producing what in military language is called simulations, games, preparing for the future, literally. But future as understood in the apocalyptic sense. It is logical because this was after the bombings. So in a sense, the worst had already happened. And in that context, the essay that Brahma mentioned, which is not really part of the book, but it's a kind of supplement to the book, thanks to Michael Marder, the American philosopher's work on this question, on Gaza. Compassionate genocide, he calls his essay, I call mine compassionate worsening. The intuition of that already was there earlier. Can there be a post-worst world? A kind of worsening beyond the worst? Counterintuitive entirely. How can there be anything beyond the worst? And yet, futurology is a science of the worsening beyond the worst. So in a way, to put it very skeptically but realistically, we live from post 20th century, post Second World War up to now, in a military milieu globally, and India is not outside of it at all, of a thinking which is thinking from the military point of view, which is also clearly the state point of view, the securitarian point of view, a thinking beyond the worst has already happened, and that is not wrong. After Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the worst has happened, no? And in a sense, after the Holocaust, the worst has happened. Both Holocaust and Nagasaki, though coming from two different agents. The worst has happened, and yet we live on. Do we live on to get better? No, we live on to worsen. So, in a sense, the context of Gaza is a context of this worsening beyond the worst. This I arrived at slowly, but the initial tools for looking at this through these lenses or this lens was already part of this kind of military thinking, which uses literally scenarios. And the theater historian Tracy Davis has actually worked on some of the theatrical devices that military history used. So all of those tools somehow I was able to, not in an academic kind of a strong systematic, and thank God for that, otherwise this book wouldn't have been so small. The best thing I can say about this book is it's very small. It'll be over before you know it. Thank God I didn't write a long book, but the tools somewhere come from some of these sources. I just wanted to give you a sense of that background because it's a kind of journey, if you want to put it like that. Now, coming to the book itself very quickly, and then we can open up for a discussion, and Brahm can come back with his points, or Rakesh, or whoever else. Many things actually. Now the sections, and Brahm is right to mention the sections. And the sections are part of a grid. They are not like linear. They're connected. They have a kind of interpenetration, but also a resonance, and sometimes they're also self-enclosed. So this question of media society, from where I receive images of, say, Gaza, so this little thing, if you notice when I say Gaza, usually we pronounce it in a certain way, Gaza. I cannot say it like that anymore, because after having heard so many times Palestinians who are living there and who are dying there say that word, I say it differently. I say it as Gaza. I am no Palestinian. I cannot speak it right, and I should not caricature it. I'm not doing playing. I'm not acting. I'm not an actor here. Yet I cannot say it like the usual neutral Gaza. Before I know it, this instantaneous thing comes out, which is a kind of inflection of the word in my voice, which is Gaza. Now this shows the distance. This doesn't show my identification with Gaza. That would be ridiculous. But it shows in an intimate way my distance from Gaza. My pronunciation of Gaza in a certain way and not in another way actually points to my distance from Gaza, not my being simply a part of Gaza, because that would be simply meaningless. And yet it cannot be a simple neutrality either, even in the word Gaza. It's a strange experience. It's a real experience, but I have to communicate this to you. And anyway, that's just a little introductory thing. But this media society, so the three principles of media society that I have deduced based on some reading and some empirical observations. First, media society consists in something which could be called, in an objective sense, a particular set of upsurges of images, sounds, and sounds are also part of images, points of views, taken together scenarios. Now what is a scenario exactly? And that is what filmmakers understand very well. It is a point of view. If you place the camera at a certain point, anything, it shoots it from that point. In that sense, it doesn't tell a story, it just tells a fragment, but it tells you what the scenario for that particular angle is. So it's an angle. Scenario is nothing but an angle, But what you have in media society is a very interesting situation of multiplicity of points of views in the same frame. Exactly the opposite of Godard, which is like one sterile camera sitting somewhere and there is not even a point of view really, a kind of emptiness. Today what we have is not just one point of view, but not just one scenario, but the multiple coexistence of several scenarios, and yet these are points of views. They are not an absolute point from where you can see everything. This is the twist of the question of the media as a social phenomenon. From the technical side, the fact that there are cameras which are shooting from every possible conceivable angle, but from the social side, something which is a structure of reception, that is, and so the other feature of media society, which is what I call, and I and Brahma are in conversation about these things in other contexts, which I call paradoxically alien and immersive at the same time. Why alien? Alien because I have no totality to relate to. Why immersive? Because there are apparently infinite points of view from within which I am watching. So the third feature of media society then becomes very interesting subjectively, intensively, affectively, as people who receive these images. Immersion causes passion. All immersion causes a certain kind of involvement, So in that sense, let me put it this way, immersion causes a kind of hotness, warmth, and it's not a bad thing, but it's an ambiguous thing, a kind of warmth of feeling in response, great revulsion and great attachment. But the other thing, alienness, causes disaffection, coldness. So what we get is a very interesting but challenging structure of the human self, as it were, in media society. We get a structure of cold-blooded passion. So yes, in my book I say that Benjamin Netanyahu has a passion, but it's a cold-blooded passion. I say this in the context of Zionism. Now, this is the media society grid, or that lock in the grid, that that point of it. The other one, very quickly, is Israel-Palestine narrative itself. Again, I'm not a specialist, but this much we know, that the Israel-Palestine narrative, on the one side, as a scenario, we are being told, like he read the preface, that no way are you going to think beyond 7th October 2023. So there is no story behind. It is all from there, which makes Hamas, in its reality, no one is saying Hamas is not real, but strangely Hamas becomes scenario, pure scenario, the scenario of the worst. Yeah. Now there is a real demonstration of this kind of state psychology or even propaganda psychology, which is not outside reality, mind you. I'm not saying it is lie. The question is not between the classic opposition between lying and telling the truth. It is a question of something which is equivocal, undecidable. So what did Israel state embassy do in South Korea towards the beginnings of the Gaza war after 7th October? In South Korea, like many other parts of the world, there were protests, early on. And the Israeli embassy made a video, a simulation, scenarios, literally, of fictitious scenes of a Hamas-like attack, this time fictitiously being launched by North Korea against South Korea, and sent it around. Said, look what Hamas did to us, North Korea could do to you. And you're protesting. Now, this is interesting. Now, this kind of a scenario, which is obviously a state securitarian strategic manipulation of all those devices at a very sophisticated level, of course, taking place. But the response of the South Korean protesters was fantastic, very mature. They said, don't tell us about the war. You don't have to show us scenarios to tell us about the reality of war. We are Koreans. We have had the Korean War. So you don't tell us about war. You don't treat us like recipients of media data. We are a historical people. So that to me was a salutary lesson, though coming again from a distance, just to illustrate the question of something like scenario. But quickly back to the grid point of Palestine, Israel. So no history, no backstory, no history, no narrative, no complicated thinking. So one tries and refuses that injunction. One is, in that sense, disobedient at an intellectual level. But more than disobedient, one is also, independent. In that sense, a kind of intellectual independence one affirms from statist, coming from Israel, but in India as much, no less. Statist injunction not to think, and so on and so forth, about critical matters. Anyway, so how to think about it now? Israel. So the question of Zionism I entered into thanks to Shakil Anjum, who is very kind enough to come today, his work on Palestine. He has a fantastic chapter whose title itself is very vivid. He calls it Palestine as documentary and Israel as fiction. But it is not an abstract title. It's actually very grounded. He's studying documents, because he's the specialist, I'm not. He's studying documents of Israeli culture, for instance, fiction, Israeli literature. The great Israeli author, Amos Oz, the Nobel Prize winning author, brilliant writer. But what does he write and how does he write? His autobiography, for instance, called A Tale of Love and Forgetting, his family history, his childhood. That's from where the child question comes. That's the material. I won't talk about it. You have to read it to find out. But that's what I thanks to Shakil's work on Amos Oz, I got some clues to the childhood in Israel. Not in the ordinary sense of childhood, but let's say the imaginary of a childhood, the ideal childhood, or even childhood as a site of propaganda, if I may say something really distressing, but real. Amos Oz, with his extraordinary, again, picturization of his past, in his scenario of recall, writes about how he basically exulted in two things as a child. And it's not a question of an Israeli child. It's a masculinist phenomenon in patriarchal societies across the world in two things: war and engineering. War and engineering. Two things we seem to love more and more, even in India. And as a child, he's fantasizing about these things: war and engineering. So a kind of childhood in Israel, please don't misunderstand, not a child in Israel, but the idea of childhood in a society which broadly is called Zionist. Now, this is a very tricky question of Zionism. Again, I'm nobody to speak theologically or historically about Zionism. Yet, I say this much, that Zionism is not a simple question of, parallelly we could talk about Hindutva, and which I do in the last part of my book, Hindutva and Hinduism, so Judaism and Zionism. So a lot of critics of Israeli actions make it a point to differentiate Zionism from Judaism. A lot of Jewish partisans of Palestine, and there are so many, they make it a point to distinguish Judaism from Zionism. So I don't really go into that. What I do say is Zionism is a kind of moment of encounter between history and a kind of theology. In the 19th century moment, which moves into 20th century, that early part of British colonialism to the 1947-48 conjuncture, when Israel is formed as an idea to the violence of a territorial usurpation of a real people, which are Palestinians, but in the wake of the worst, which is the Holocaust. So in a strange way, Israel begins not as a nation state as much as a state nation. Long years back, I'd heard, I think Akash Singh Rathod used this phrase. It stuck in my head in a different context. But a kind of state nation, a kind of voluntarist state nation to make the nation come alive in an, it's a very interesting, but I don't know what to call it, dangerous project. Anyway, so that moment, but I don't dwell on that moment. I have to come back to where I am, which is today. So what I'm saying is, and this Zionism, and Edward Said has done extraordinary work on this Zionism is indeed an affective structure, because there is a Zionism of every kind of political ideology, that I found out more and more when I read about these things, again thanks to Shakil mostly. There's a Zionism of capitalism, there's a Zionism of socialism, and of course there's a Zionism of nativism. There's a Zionism of everything. But in the earlier period, you could say this was a hot Zionism, a kind of Zionism which had a lot of hot passion, which could be militarily exercised, but also ideologically argued. So there are great Zionist scholars, philosophers, who otherwise are not warmongers at all, but in crucial moments are dodgy. You never know what they will do when it comes to an Israel question. On everything else, they are the greatest philosophers of the world. Again and again, I'm not taking names, and they are some of the philosophers I have learned from. Again and again this happens. But this much has to be said, these philosophers are warm thinking people. Then comes, I don't know what to put it, it's an awkward way of putting it, but I hope you know what I'm trying to get at. And a hot thinking, when thinking has a kind of lifeblood. Passion. This changes, it seems to me, in media society. I don't want to parodize it, but in the present, if you speak of a Zionism, it is a Zionism of a kind, but it's a cold Zionism. In that sense, it's just Zionism without its own historicity. This is my point, that in media society, there is a degradation or denudation, a weakening of temporal processual thinking. What is thinking? Thinking needs, in that sense, historicity, documents, materials, but also speculative possibilities, but across time. Instantaneous society, or instantaneous as well as repetitive society, alien immersive situations produce the shock of thought, but do not produce or cannot, or they block the process of thinking. This is what I'm trying to get at. If you want to call this philosophical, you're being very kind, but I'm trying something like this in the context of something as real as the war. So that when it comes to saying, look, this is horrible, and it is, then you also say, yeah, this is horrible, but you know, they started it all. They started it all. You know, they burned babies. Now, see, again, let us assume scenario-wise, babies were burnt at some point. But babies, God, how can I talk like this? Plain bomb drops. The other day in the school, a bomb dropped, no? And yesterday there was a report that a father had to bury some 8 or 10 parts of the child's body. Because there was no body, there were parts of the body. Now, what will you say? You're going to oppose scenario to scenario now? Is that going to, I mean, can we do it? Are we human? I mean, inhuman enough to do that? To oppose one scenario to the other? The Hamas to the Israel and so on it goes? That's the black hole of scenario thinking I talk about. In a very real sense. But at the same time, that is a reality, which is a cold-blooded reality of mobilization. So there is another point about scenario thinking, no, not scenario thinking, the other part of media society, which is actually a serious part of, I don't know, one has to think about it very carefully. The question of knowledge in media society. On the one hand, there is indeed more knowledge today than any time before us about everything, including Palestine and Israel. But at the same time, that knowledge is indeed objectively presented as data. So there is again an undecidability on the one side, something very important. That's why protesters are able to mobilize people on the basis of real facts shown through this data. That look, this is happening. You can see it. There's no speculative, thing here. It's real. On the other hand, because it is so saturated with points of views and scenarios, it can also be relativized. So every time you show something, they will say, there is another thing I have to show you. Endless relativism. Not just between images, in the image itself. So I show you the image and you say, oh, this image is actually manipulated from this angle, with this technology. And for all you know, it might be true. It is true. States are manipulating, video technology all the time. But this is but at the same time, it is in media society that we have actually a living archive, which is uniquely public. This is a kind of forensic opening up, and at the same time, a peculiarly epistemological, or I don't know what to call it, a kind of a relativization of truth. So this is a kind of situation of knowledge within which I, like all of us, are trying to work or think about Gaza. Now comes the question of thought. The book is called Thoughts of Gaza, Far from Gaza. Yes, on the one it's obvious, I'm far from Gaza. So if I think about Gaza, what right do I have? So my answer is clear. Those who have the right are not doing it. Things are so bad, someone like me has to do it. Seriously. Look where we have ended. I have to write a book about that which I really, my hand trembles to write a line about it. And yet I do it, yes. It's as bad as that. But there's another side to this question of, writing a book like this and thoughts of Gaza. Of is what in grammar is called genitive, possessive. You can read the of in both directions. So you can read it as in thoughts of Gaza, as in thoughts about Gaza. But you can also read it in the subjective side. Thoughts of Gaza is Gaza's thought. What Gaza thinks. So in a way, I'm conscious about this double movement of the title, the first part of the title, Thoughts of Gaza. Because on the one hand, if I'm far from Gaza, how can I record anything of Gaza? I can only, at the most, from a distance, do a broad kind of a noting down of certain speculations, like, in a sense, Godard. Though, of course, with a strong commitment. I didn't say this about Godard. It was understood that Godard did it with a commitment, which was a political commitment to opposing the Vietnam War and American imperialism. So there is a commitment. That speculation has a strong, real commitment, mind you, totally. But it's still speculative, because that's the condition then. Today, whatever be my commitment, I am not speculative, but at the same time I'm far. So you see, the other question arises. If in these images, in this instant, in the real of this massacre, genocide, is it possible to think about something as aristocratic and leisurely as thought? If thought is to be thought of as something surplus, only in leisure time, which we call intellectuality, I oppose this philosophy of thinking. And Brahma pointed that out. In a way, this book is written to a commitment. I'm not saying I'm a activist, philosopher I take a distance from anyway, or anything like that. But the commitment is to, broadly, the principle and capacity of public reasoning. That is my commitment. Public reasoning, with all its impasses, all its problems, with all the difficulties of, for instance, a media society. Nevertheless, something as classical as public reasoning. So in that sense, I'm not the only one in India who wants to exercise her capacity for public reasoning. I'm saying in the worst, which is worsening, even in Gaza there is public reasoning. That is my affirmation. In that sense, you can call it speculative. I do not know what to do with it, but it is affirmation of public reasoning at the very last instance also. Even when you're dying, I somehow would affirm the capacity for thinking. I would not say, oh, in that sense I oppose this Agamben's idea of bare life in a very broad sense. In a very pinpointed sense, I think it's a very powerful idea. But the idea that there is something like a, life without thought, not human, which is bare life in general, when physically it looks like that, yes. Yet I think there is something to be affirmed of the surplus. That's why when Slavoj Zizek recently, who is a great voice of solidarity with Gaza, nevertheless said something as strange as Americans should enter Gaza and sort of hold it against, hold the Israelis back, and imperialism for a good cause. And then he goes on to say that at least the people in Gaza would welcome it, because it would be relief for them. I am not so sure they would. Even if they were given the guarantee that with, say, Americans coming in to make their lives relatively peaceful, as an idea to have Americans govern them, in that sense lose their independence, even when they are not independent. But in a sense, when they are not independent, for the sake of what we call security of life, to become even more not independent. Because it's America now, which was a strange scenario, Zizek. But then Zizek admitted it's a crazy solution for a crazy time. But it's not the craziness I like at all. Because I think even when the people in Gaza, it's only a speculation at this level, even when people in a situation like Gaza are in that last ditch moment, there is a surplus of thought, which is also a surplus of, that's where we come to independence. It's a surplus of independence. In that sense, there are people. Ilan Pappé, the great Israeli historian, a rebellious voice in the Israeli intellectual world against the Israeli state, very early on said, what Israel wants to do to Palestine is not just genocide in the physical sense, because really they might want to commit genocide, plan a genocide. Eventually, one trace of a voice will remain. That you will not be able to kill. No way. Just like Jews came back. And I mean, despite all the Israel, terror today, I mean, salute to the Jews for always coming back. Absolutely. So, Ilan Pappé said the real issue is something else, not something else, related, but phrase it differently, phrase it politically, and say simply this: what Israel wants to do is to deprive Palestinian people of their peoplehood. To me, the question of independence is this: there are two ways of thinking about independence: independence of and independence from. Indeed, quickly come to India. Indeed, if we speak about Indian independence, it is commemorating a year, a day of a specific instance of independence in the ceremonial sense also, as well as in the political sense, clearly, which is independence from the state of Britain, from British colonialism, imperialism, empire. Do we ever say Indian people were freed from the British people? Has anyone ever said of any people, even with everything going on and a tremendous majoritarian, I mean, that's another story. We don't have the time for that. Maybe in the discussion we can come to that. The majoritarian world of Israel today in society. And in India, we are not too far away from those tendencies, at least in certain situations. Anyway, do we still say, will we ever say Palestinian people want independence from Israeli people? See, we'll say from Israel, the state of Israel. है ना कि आज़ादी किस किस चीज़ से, ब्राह्मणवाद से आज़ादी, इस पर बात यहाँ कैंपस में हो चुकी है, बहुत कमाल की बातें हुई हैं. So that is a endless project, no doubt. Nevertheless, when Azadi is spoken of, then it's Azadi in a sense of all people, people as such. Then we come to the last point. I've taken too much time, sorry about that, but just this last point of state. Because people from the independence from the state implies, it seems, formation of new state and Palestine's demand for new state. Now that is a very serious and again a historically dense question. Today, in the wake of the pressure of the Israeli genocidal war, some states, European states, like say Norway and Ireland, have officially supported Palestine as an independent state. So in the UN, they would be on the side of Palestine as an independent state. Many countries are coming out with that. US remains totally stubborn, and opposes all. Anyway, we know that. Now, the question of independence as a state is very important for a real reason, that if you become an independent state, you get relief from what is going on. And you also get, of course, a discursive space of independent, autonomous, decision making of your own people. Nevertheless, you are inserted into, you're not just a state. An independent state is never a state alone. You're inserted into a system of states. This is the real puzzle, today. Let me end with that question. In the system of states, from America to South Africa, where so much has happened in this context, to, let's take Iran and Yemen, who have a very different role in all this, no? Then Egypt and Qatar, who are playing the role of mediation, negotiation, and so on. Each of them is a state, and they form not a club of isolated states, but a system of states, a network of states. Quickly, if you jump to other contexts of war, Ukraine, Russia, and so on and so forth, again you get names of states which are in some kind of a relation to each other, even if conflictual. Now, the thing is, it is something which is really, and I, Rakesh, Debjyoti, maybe I've shared this with Brahma, maybe not today, this is a good occasion, and with all of you, let me pose this real puzzle to you. In the system of states, with degrees of political freedoms, social equality, and so on and so forth, including in India, of course. Empirically, what you see is, in Israel, for instance, with all its majoritarian backing up of the state's absurdly cruel genocidal violence, yet there are protests against the state. In my book, I have actually cited a small protest clip that I saw somewhere, where there was a girl, there was a woman who was protesting with a placard, and 3-4 people, and she was running from, in Tel Aviv, I think, or some other town of Israel, from one point to the other. And the interviewer asked her, but in any moment the police will come and kind of move you out, or even worse, the majoritarian kind of psychology which leads most of the ordinary citizens of that city will come and, God knows what they'll do to you. So she said, no, we have to do this to register the fact that we exist. So in that sense, in Israel too, people exist who are not just the Israeli state people. Now, with all the difficulties of Israel, the fact is these protests do happen in a way that you will probably not see in many other parts of the world in their states. Israel is doing something which is quantitatively as bad, if not the worst thing that is happening in today's world. But in Israel, with all its problems, in a decline, yet some protests are happening, which will not be possible. I don't want to take names because that would be, pointing fingers at state, but several states you can imagine, it's inconceivable. They'll be able to carry out public protests. In India, it is very dodgy how far you can go. If, God forbid, something like that were to happen in India, then to conceive of protests, very difficult to imagine, no? And yet in Israel, it is in its decline. In its worst phase, it is still happening. In the US, the other day Netanyahu spoke there, Laurence Olivier didn't get as many claps as in his greatest performances as Netanyahu got from the Senate. 50 ovations. The greatest actor of the world wouldn't get that many ovations, which Netanyahu got. Yet there are protests. Now this is a puzzle. In societies which are called, within quotes, formally democratic, though Israel is a very complicated ethno-national democracy, nevertheless, where civil rights are available constitutionally to citizens, there seems to be, at its worst, some remnant of robust civil rights possibility, exactly when these very states, because you can't speak of Israel in isolation, you have to speak of Israel in connection with the system of states which is symbolized by American imperialism in totality, they are able to do what they're doing in Gaza every day, brazenly, while speaking of compassion and aid and so on. Hence Marder has his right to speak of compassionate genocide, and so on it goes. Now the puzzle is, we cannot oppose civil rights. We cannot say Israeli people shouldn't have, we should strengthen that movement, whether in Israel, in India or America. But the fact that a society which does have some minimally better situation in these matters is, by that very token, by the legitimation it enjoys as being the paradigm of democracy, is able to kill people to the extent they are killing in Gaza. How does one go beyond this impasse? That is the problem today, as I talk to you, I face. And thank you for bearing with me up to this moment. Thank you.
Yeah, so anyway, I was joining as an initiator, so I have already initiated, and now we got the kinds of more length response of the book. And I just have one very small questions, and after that we can take 2-3 questions from audience, because I think it's also getting late. So one that whole this Marder's response about that whole thinking about compassionate genocide, because one way of thinking about it looks quite paradoxical, that is it genuine compassion that one is talking about? Very no idea of the compassion becomes but one that if you are thinking about some kinds of charity program, if you are thinking about airdropping of foods and things, then you see that there is intention, there is some kinds of compassionate intention is there. So in a way I was thinking that is there possibility to read that whole compassionate genocide in a different way, or do you have some other kinds of there is a you are still reading in that essay, you are still reading that chapter, you are still reading in a different way, but I am still not quite convinced with this whole idea of totally convinced with this whole idea of the compassionate genocide, the way Marder is trying to convey here. And so, and that, I think that is the one otherwise you have already replied to some of the questions that I already done.
Very quickly, compassionate genocide, you're right to point out, this is the same thing as humanitarian ideology. So that's why you'll notice that people who work on the ground, doctors and different sectors in Gaza today, from all over the world, people are coming and doing work there, are all called in general, and they identify themselves mostly as humanitarians. It's a very interesting carnage that humanitarian seems to be something different from merely human beings. So compassion here is not really compassion in the sense of the natural sentiment or emotion that we all feel or are supposed to feel, which is called compassion, along with other feelings such as, it could even be hate.
Yeah.
This is not really that. You're right to point out that here compassion means a structure, and you yourself teach this concept so well to all of us, what Raymond Williams calls structure of feeling. It's more like a structure of feeling which is prescribed by capitalism. Humanitarian ideology. Now, no, but your question is very serious. I don't think Marder in any way, and neither do I, neither does anyone else, in any way belittle the actual work by people that come in the form of what is called humanitarian, humanitarian work. No. The real people who do it, I mean, they are extraordinary people. They are the people and they're also thinking. You see, they are not merely working and doing. So it's a very risky area, but let me just attempt a risky hypothesis. There was a big problem with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency in Gaza. The work they were doing, that a part of their people, some small part, 7 or 8, are supposed to have joined the Hamas October 7th action. So the moment that thing came to light, or at least the suspicion was raised, the UNRWA was the main aid agency, absolutely crucial aid to all of Gaza. Much of the aid was cut off, and of course the aid all comes from the different countries, the rich nations. So when we speak of state, the system of states, what does it mean? The system of state means the rich capitalist nations, as simple as that. So the third term beyond nation and place is capitalism. I haven't really talked about it, but it is always there. So you need capital. UNRWA was getting that, so they were able to provide aid. But moment that suspicion arose, all aid was cut off. And Israel went to town about all of UNRWA being a Hamas agent. Now that is a factual question, forensic question. And now they have finally sent out a report, an investigation report by UNRWA itself, which says yes, a small part did possibly take part, but that in any way has nothing to do with the rest of the organization. But you see, suppose you think of it subjectively, almost like a scenario, alternative scenario, like a story. What does it mean to say some people took part in the action? The action itself, again, is like I write in the book, it is the most extreme scenario you can conceive of, though that scenario remains subject to endless, recounting in different ways. Anyway, that apart. What does it mean? It means some people were either convinced by Hamas thinking, Hamas ideology, or they were pushed into doing that. We have to take political action. Humanitarian action is not enough. Yeah. No, that action could be the most terrible action. But the thought that leads to that action is produced by real conditions. No. These doctors, I am not propagating the cause of doctors becoming militants. I'm not saying that at all. But suppose a doctor who has to do stuff that a doctor is doing, and I have heard and read so much of these incidents where a doctor has to perform surgery without anesthesia, which means it's a dehumanization of the doctor. Suppose the doctor decides to do something else from merely being a doctor, becomes what is called a militant. Is that unthinkable? So no one takes anything away from the real courage, probably the greatest courage today of those who work in for humanitarian aid. In that sense, feel real compassion. Real compassion. I don't think Marder would at all, would deny that. On the contrary. But compassion is an ideology. Suppose, say, one of them becomes a militant, and there are so many films, where doctors have become Naxalites. In a very real sense, not just films, stories, real people. Then what will happen? The ideology of compassion says, same thing, go kill them. In a moment, compassion has become as if you are not a compassionate person anymore. You have become a terrorist. Now, it's the state's job to do whatever. That is what we are questioning with the word compassionate genocide. Now, the incident, let me quickly mention the incident on which this guy wrote his article. See what happened was, my book was more or less, the text was finished in March this year. On March 13th, I think, a strange incident happened in Gaza on the border, on the sea beach. America had set up a pier to apparently facilitate aid. Israel had closed off all the borders, including the Egyptian border. So the trucks with aid couldn't come in. So you had Americans dropping aid from the air, and some of it landed on the head, on some real people from Gaza, from Palestine, some 7 or 8 of them, and they died. 6 of them, they died. So this, in a way, became an illustration of the cruelty, the irony, the cruel irony of an aid which kills. So Martyr asks, for a real person, what difference does it make if I am killed by a bomb or aid? And he's right, because you're killed by the structure. You know. So that is really the incident we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So now we can take some questions if you have some. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sir, my question.
Can we take 2, 3? Yeah. Just like.
No, please, Shaurya. Yeah, please. Yeah.
So I'm just saying that we can take 2 together. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Sir, my
Thank you, Shaurya.
Sir, my question is, sir, you have brought out the poison of Gaza in juxtaposing to Israel.
Yeah.
So, but what about the silence of the international community? Does Gaza also feeling the silence of the international community in this movement of Israel, which is governed by its own self-interest in the name
True.
of realist world order and all?
Absolutely.
So what about the international community?
Yeah.
So what about the Western?
Absolutely.
Israel is not the only actor in this.
Quite right.
There are
Yeah.
many actors whose silence is supporting Israel.
Absolutely.
Have you covered those aspects? Because I am afraid I have been here in your talk about these other actors.
Yeah. So should I answer, Shaurya?
We can take one
One more. Yeah,
please.
please. Yeah.
So my question.
Take the mic if you want, पर यहाँ आना पड़ेगा उसके
Okay,
लिए.
go, sir. Yeah.
हाँ, ठीक.
So my question is, why thinking?
हाँ.
You spoke about
So like,
films, thinking, history, a lot of things. Thoughts, history, films, they have also been made during Vietnam. Thoughts of Vietnam is there, films of Vietnam is there.
Yeah.
During Hiroshima, Nagasaki. But yet we are at this conjuncture where we are speaking about the worsening of an unsayable, unimaginable,
Right.
pessimistic future.
Right.
So why thinking? Is it a human egoistic nature of that you said, na, I exist, the signature of I exist. My question is why I exist, even though there is an unsayable, pessimistic future.
Interesting. Can I just take these two first? नहीं तो भूल जाऊंगा
yeah.
मैं.
हाँ, ठीक.
है ना? इतनी सीरियस सवाल है कि भूल जाऊंगा मैं. है ना? तो शौर्या का पहले. Shaurya, I did mention the system of states. So that was about really what we call the West. But with West there are two histories. One is the colonization history, which very much Israel carries forward with coming into what is called the Asiatic part of the world. But there is also equally the capitalist history of 20th century up to the present, which in a sense has a different anthropological premise. And you would know about it. You know, in the early 20th century, in American foreign policy, there was the famous, and I've written about it in the book, there was the famous, notorious actually, Monroe Doctrine, which actually is an inheritance from American independence, I mean, early America, early American nation's history from early 19th century. But in the 20th century, that was used to justify coup after coup in South America, up to Chile, when Allende, the communist, communist president, had come into power, and there was a CIA-backed coup, and there were so many coups. Each of them was justified by a theory of civilization, that these societies are not civilized enough to appreciate what democracy is. Yeah, so there was actually a differential anthropology that was more or less accepted by so-called Western colonizing thinking ideology, that there are some human beings which are one kind of human beings, and then there are some others, South America being one of the examples of such human beings, where there was a kind of human being but less than human, which you have to civilize. One of the ways of doing it is to bring democracy. Yeah. Now, you cannot quite use the same. In effect, you do, but not as a theory, not as a discourse. The Monroe Doctrine cannot be used in the same way today. Theodore Roosevelt actually added this kind of a cultural anthropological layer to the Monroe Doctrine. It's called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was used by America, so many times in South America, because Monroe Doctrine pertained to Americas. Today, we have many kinds of international policies, but one of the policies is strange. It's brazenly, nakedly contradictory. On the one hand, we have a universalism of humanism. So the same question of compassion, humanitarianism, that everyone is human. Everyone is capable of democracy then, with same rights intrinsically. Palestinians have intrinsically, according to this doctrine, the same rights as Israelis, as Americans, as Indians, anybody. On the one hand, you have that theory. On the other hand, you have a real, like you correctly said, Shaurya, a real genocide supported by the American and the international community state system. I don't like the word community in this context. I like to say state system. So that's why we have something which is widespread protests in those very international state system, those regions which are called the West in the earlier colonizing sense, which are actually the vanguard. Though not only in Europe and West, in South Africa too. I mentioned the example of South Korea. I will talk about India a little bit at the very end, just 2 minutes, because some criticisms of the book are already emerging, which is very interesting for me. I'll talk about it in a moment. So, it's the state system which is in question now. What you call the international community silence is not just the silence, but the active participation. Participate. Absolutely, you're right. What I call, you're right, in India too. Absolutely true. Absolutely. Exactly, I was coming to that. Exactly, collaborate. Yeah, that's exactly what we're saying. It's a silence which is participative, it is a participation which, that's exactly what we're saying. It's a participation which carries on through being in key matters silent. I'll tell you what silence is. Silence is also a media strategy. Have you followed the American spokesperson's day-to-day?
Actually, the spokesperson of the American administration, from day one, he doesn't have any answer.
Exactly. Silence. You're right.
It's not silence. It is a stupid way of doing
it's a
double standard.
You're totally right.
Double standard.
I agree with you.
One thing for Palestinian and there is another system for the Israelis.
Totally. That's exactly what we're saying. Absolutely.
The India is part of this collaborative. They are giving them arms, they are giving them, and God knows what.
I agree with you. That is exactly.
I have some reports which there is some forces from the Indian army secretly is operating with them.
Quite likely.
It's not silence, it's
Collaborative silence. Anyway, So that is exactly what we are saying. That's exactly. So your voice is the strongest here in saying this, and we join you in solidarity with your. Of course.
Can we have?
About the UNRWA things, actually those people, even from day one, UNRWA, it has been created, this organization has been created when the occupation happened.
Right.
To support the refugee. Okay?
I know.
So those people, even like if you, I think you are aware of the International Kitchen.
Right. Of course, I know that.
They have coordinated with the Israeli forces that we are going to be in this stage, in this point. And
I know.
And they are aware, fully aware, and they pumped them. They killed them all.
I know. Yeah. Totally right. Totally right.
They don't care about anything, and they said, "Oh, it is a mistake."
Exactly.
They are killing kids. They are bombing everything. Okay. There is one thing which you have said about Hamas 2007, the scenario of Hamas worse. I don't know what did you mean with that. I want to ask you.
So that's
I
exactly.
haven't read your
So this is exactly what I. Very nice. This is what Brahm also pointed out. The worst is the supposition. So it is a strategy of saying, suppose we start with the premise that whatever the action might be, it is the worst. Yeah. No, listen to me. Just give me half a minute. Just half a minute. Yeah. So this is. So if you read the book, you'll see how it. How it unfolds. Suppose we say it is the worst. What does it achieve? Does it actually achieve finding out about 7th October? What happened? No. What it achieves is silencing us or making us collaborators.
The Palestinian, I want to tell you something. I'm a
Sure.
Palestinian.
Sure. Yeah. Of course.
Palestinian, for us, all the Palestinian people, they are supporting Hamas. From not the Palestinian Authority, for your point, for your kind of information. At all. The people, they are good believers, they believe in God, and they say that they are getting killed every day. Like in West Bank, they are getting killed every day.
I know. I read about that here.
Hamas or not Hamas, they don't differentiate.
Absolutely.
This is Hamas,
Yeah.
they are killing everybody.
Yeah.
So they are killing every day they are killing hundreds
Yeah,
or five
yeah,
or 6 or
yeah,
10.
yeah.
So I mean, like, let it be.
Right.
Once and for all. Like,
Right.
we are not going to lose anything. We are losing already.
Absolutely. We listened to you very carefully, and like I said, that everything that I learned from you in listening to you and talking to you is something which makes me, in a way, write this book every day. Absolutely, there's no question. I'm writing this book every day. What you read is not the last book. It is not. That's my. It is not the last book. Now, there's a real criticism also coming in India. So yesterday, I got a message from indirectly from somewhere, which was a very interesting criticism that I have said in India nothing is happening, and I feel frustrated, depressed, weak. And the message was, no, the picture is not right. There is immense repression in India. But in all of this, there are people, protesting. One of the protests is, for instance, against, like you pointed out very correctly, weapon manufacturing companies, including Adani. Yeah, exactly. So this was something very important for me because, coincidentally what happened was, yesterday I learned that in Greece, an American ship carrying weapons fuel to Israel, either coming back or going, was not allowed to dock in Israel by pro-Palestinian or anti-war protesters. So you see, this is what I call a collective solidarity, not just at the level of people, but people as thinking. To know which ship is docking where and carrying what, you need to think. People cannot be assumed merely to act or merely to, be the recipients of experts' knowledge. People are also thinking, a kind of forensic protest, where you know which ship is going where. At the same time, you're also not just thinking academically, you're thinking by intervening. So you're trying to, even if 10 people, 100 people, 50 people, that can change. And finally, this is a people's protest across countries, across regions. In that sense, it is not Greek people or Indian people. To that extent, I agree with the critic who has criticized he or she read it in some extract which came out, and I agree with that criticism that I missed this forensic point-to-point protest between an Indian protester, even if he or she is one person, with a Greek to an American, because each of them is a associational and at the same time intellectual people, even when they're intervening through militant action. That is how I look at it. Yeah. So in a way, that's also answering your question. Is that I can't see. Snehashish, I thought it was you. So that is my reply. Thinking is not to do with theories and contemplation here. Of course, contemplation and theory, like I said, Godard's speculation has a certain importance, because Godard is saying that my alienation as a filmmaker, as an intellectual in the West, is something which I also register in my film. Let's not make that. Alienation can lead to many things. It can lead to indifference, it can lead to passivity, but it can lead to political thinking. So let's not discount that. Now, obviously, you're right. That thinking will not be efficacious as to affect state policy. But then thinking is not really policy driven, no? Thinking is never policy driven. Yeah. So to that extent, let's not make thinking an affair of the specialists and the so-called official philosophers. What Rakesh said in the beginning, I again affirm, something which I can broadly call public intellectuality, egalitarian intellectuality, I think is something, you can't show it, you can't prove it, but I'd like to affirm it in the worsening.
Okay, so we can have a second round.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, फिर से बोलो, please.
South Africa taking Israel to.
हाँ, yeah, I've written. हाँ, thank you. और भी एक सवाल दो ले लेते हैं.
Almost final.
हाँ, हाँ.
Why did you decide to choose Gaza instead of Palestine?
Yeah, good. Very interesting question. Yeah. First, yeah. So yeah, you're asking about. So there is a section on little bit on the ICJ proceedings. Now, the International Court of Justice proceedings, on the one hand, bring the issue to a kind of forum, which is a global forum, discussion, central kind of preoccupation it becomes. At the same time, realists know that even if the ICJ has said there is a plausible genocide, using legal language, in Gaza, in Gaza particularly, and Palestine as such, the actual verdict will take God knows how many years. We know it. So in my book, what I say is the ICJ is the legal form is only really an opening to a public discussion on a level which is not legal itself. Not even concerned with only the legitimacy of legally defined genocide and legally defined collateral damage and legally defined what act in war is acceptable and not acceptable. Because that is totally frustrating when it comes from whether the American spokesperson and his or her total silence and participation, like he pointed out, and the international state system. Yeah, it is almost like saying, because the legitimacy we have as democracies is so great, let us test this legitimacy by doing the worst illegitimate action, and let's see how far we can go, and force the people to accept it. So the ICJ becomes a small but important occasion or sort of pretext to open up a public discussion, which is a critical discussion. The verdict in the legal court, there is very little hope of anything happening there in the foreseeable future. So that is one. Now this question is very interesting. Gaza, it was I don't know what to say. While I'm speaking in terms of reason and all that, it was an intuitive decision, I think. First of all. Second of all, there is a point about Gaza as a place. So so there are two citations. Let me end because we are ending now. Yeah. It's dinner time and you people also have to leave. Let me end with two citations, both of which are very close to my heart as I read and learnt about these things. First, in the context of Gaza, a particular health worker, British health worker, she came back and she says that what I have seen is the worst. I have not seen anything. I have been to different war-torn regions of the world, but I have not seen anything like it. So, see, these are specific concrete questions. This was also the time of Rafah moment. Yeah, when it was seeming that everyone is moving towards the only last refuge was Rafah, and Israel was saying, well, we are going to go for Rafah. Then what happens was, this person says, she says that, so she was asked, how is it in Rafah? How is it, slightly to the south? She says, but I don't have Gaza I don't have a bird's eye view on Gaza. So for me, Gaza is not like a place on the map or a film or a frame. Gaza is an experience. And that experience for me is something which is shattering. So to me, this was a very challenging moment. That on the one hand, the reality of Gaza as something which I don't share because I'm not in that reality. Nevertheless, I feel the shock of that reality as something which cannot be spoken about, and yet someone who is coming from there is trying to give voice to it, like a testimony which is impossible, and saying, I can't speak of Gaza as an object. Because you see, exactly then I heard one Palestinian person say in an interview, because the whole world was talking about Rafah at that time, even the ones who were sympathizing and empathizing and solidarity with Gaza, that Rafah, let Israel not do anything in Rafah, it will be the worst. And this person said, because that person was somewhere else, in Khan Yunis, somewhere else, I forget which place, said, why are you only talking about Rafah? We are in as great a grave a situation. Now, this person was not saying that, selfishly, egoistically. She was saying that, again, speak of Gaza as a whole. And you cannot, if you speak of it only in an objectified way, like an image, like a scenario. That was what I was trying to bring out through this title, Thoughts of Gaza. That's one. Now, the second point about Palestine. Yet, you're right. Palestine must be the name, if you must have a name, of a people. Though I do not want to speak of state, though the demand for the state is absolutely crucial today, yet as such, the question of the state is, I'm a pessimist as far as the state is concerned, in general. That apart, Palestine. In that sense, Palestine is a kind of horizon of liberation. In that sense, it's also a clarion call for internationalism, solidarity. You see, what happened was, again, in one of my encounters with media stories and images, I saw an interview of a South African journalist. So South Africa features in different ways. The case, but also a South African journalist who was present at a meeting which was a commemoration or marking or something of journalists killed in Gaza by Israeli military. And this person, he was a South African, said that we are doing this in the spirit of solidarity is a life-giving principle, as Marx said, he quoted. So in the poster for this program, we have put that slogan. It is not my slogan. It is not even Marx's slogan, actually. Marx might have said it, that's all very well. It's a slogan from within the Palestine struggle and solidarity with Palestine in the real situation. In that sense, let me end with, simply saying this: solidarity is a life-giving principle. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So again, whenever you get time, please get the copy of the book and try to read it. I think it gives you a picture, but also a lot of many things that perhaps we have not covered here. So great to be here, and thank you for your patience and for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.